series on sin. We spent several weeks in introduction and then a few weeks on anger. We've recently been talking about lying for 3 Sundays, and now this morning we're going to begin considering sins against marriage. I want to say thank you to Pastor Eric and Heidi Jean and Emma and Daniel for leading us through that worship and music this morning. This theme of sins against marriage is a sober one, for sure. A hard one. One that comes up very quickly in Genesis, not long after Cain's anger and his murder. And we just read in 1 Thessalonians 4, the Lord is the avenger in all these things. What a line that is. So if we look in Genesis 4 to verse 16, it says, Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. And he built a city, called the name of the city Enoch, after the name of his son. Now to Enoch was born Irad, and Irad became the father of Mehujael, and Mehujael became the father of Methushael, and Methushael became the father of Lamech, and Lamech took to himself 2 wives. 2 wives. We briefly mentioned this a few months ago, that if you started in Genesis 1 and you started reading, seeking to learn about marriage, Genesis 4:19 would be really jarring. 2 wives? Look back in Genesis 2. Verse 18. Then the Lord God said, It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him. Out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the sky and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. Whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper suitable for him. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh at that place. The Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man and brought her to the man. The man said, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. And Lamech took 2 wives? Is there anything jarring there? The marriage relationship is exclusive. It's a one-of-a-kind helper, an exclusive cleaving to one another, a private one-flesh relationship. We use the word intimate to describe what is meant to be private, exclusive, and secret. If it's intimate, it's not for others to see or know. It's uniquely special. So how can you possibly bring in a second wife? Now Lamech has 2 uniquely intimate relationships, 2 exclusive, loyal, faithful, one-of-a-kind relationships. Call it polygamy if you'd like. Call it free love if you'd like. But what we should call it is sin against God's plan for marriage. Marriage was instituted as part of the way things ought to be, part of shalom. It was not good for the man to be alone, God said. So marriage was a part of what God declared to be good. It was part of human flourishing. But sin, or anti-shalom, is like a virus that spreads everywhere and affects everything. So of course it affected marriage. It not only attacked Adam and Eve's bodies and their relationship with God, it immediately attacked their relationship with one another. So we could say that marriage is under attack from the first pages of the Bible. Yet marriage won't go away. A culture might attack marriage and suggest that everyone would be happier if there was no marriage, or promote no-fault divorce or homosexuality or other alternatives to marriage. But no matter what human adjustments we try to make, you can't change the intrinsic nature of the human heart. Genesis 2:18, when it says, It is not good for the man to be alone, those words are as relevant today as they were when God spoke those words. You can't change the intrinsic nature of the human heart. It's often said that marriage is under attack in America. Yet everywhere you look, you see humanity's God-given desire for faithful companionship, loyal love, and intimacy. How many movies have some hint of a type of intimate relationship in them? The better question is, how many movies don't, right? How many Disney princesses exist with no prince involved? How many songs on the radio, if you just turned your average rock or country station or whatever, how many songs will have something to do with intimate relationships, even if it's a very twisted view of that? Consider even the absolutely pervasive nature of sexually explicit material that is everywhere in our culture. Why does it even exist? If God's ideas for marriage are such a dud, why are there billions of dollars to be made from selling sensuality? You can attack marriage all you want, but you can't change the fact that the human heart longs for faithful companionship, loyal love, and intimacy. It's important for us to understand that the greatest threat to marriage is not politics. And I'm not saying that there aren't political issues that matter, but folks, the greatest threat to marriage is always sin. Not laws, sin. And so a discussion about the sins against marriage is as relevant as ever. Now, there are lots of matters of introduction here. First of all, please realize that in this series, I cannot possibly address every complicated issue related to marriage. Divorce, abortion, homosexuality, adultery, birth control, gender roles and other gender issues, polygamy, parenting, childlessness, singleness. This could become the sermon series that never ends. So we'll have to keep our focus a little more on the big picture. And so the series is challenging just because the issues are so vast and so complicated. The series is also challenging because marriage matters are hard to talk about. And so let me list a few of the reasons why. First of all, we welcome children in our services, and yet marriage is an intimate adult institution, and the Bible talks about marriage in explicitly adult ways. And so while I work very, very hard to keep our services child-friendly, there's a point at which I would have to stop reading Scripture anymore and saying what Scripture says to keep them completely child-friendly on some of these issues. So I'm going to be very careful in what I say this morning, but there could be a week or two in the near future where I'll send out a church email to you in advance of Sunday morning and let you know that I'll be bringing up some things that aren't appropriate for some of the younger children in that week's sermon. So keep an eye out for a church email to that end. Second, talking about marriage might seem awkward because marriage is not God's purpose for everyone. One of the first church services I was ever at in California, we were here visiting, and I just wanted to get a feel for what church life was like. We went to a couple of the big-name churches here in Southern California, and the man preaching said in his sermon that it is God's purpose for every person to marry. And I just was staggered at how someone reading the Bible could come to that, reading the New Testament could come to that conclusion. And such a painfully wrong, damaging conclusion. Some of the most prominent women in the New Testament were single or had past broken by immorality or multiple marriages. Some of the most prominent men in the New Testament were single, including Jesus himself. And in one particular situation, Paul said to the Corinthians, I wish that everyone was single like me, but each has his own gift from God. So someone could say, oh boy, we're going to talk about marriage. That is not relevant for me. And I would just ask us to realize that as a church, we join together on a journey of differences. Our paths are different, yet we choose to bring them together, and we choose to care about other people whose circumstances are different from our own. We choose to bear the burdens of other people whose burdens we do not understand. And so a single mom, a divorcee, a childless person, a grandparent, someone married with many children. Okay, it's all different, right? It all looks different. But we never in the church say, I don't care what your problems are. I don't care what your life looks like. I don't care what your challenges are. Every direction in that webbing of differences, we say, I do care. I do want to understand. I do want to hear why it's hard for you with 5 children. And I do want to hear why it's hard for you still single. And I do want to hear why it's hard for you remarried. And I do want to hear why it's hard for you widowed. And I do want to hear why it's hard for you divorced. And we do want to follow Jesus, and I do care. See that? So there's a sense in which we shouldn't ever say, well, that's not relevant for me. If it applies to somebody in this church family, it's relevant for you because we are one body. Third, these things are difficult to talk about because they can be so painful. I mean, the mention of marriage brings pain for so many people because of their story or their parents' story or something else. There is so much wrong, so many hurts, so much heartbreak, yet that is part of the point. The intimacy of marriage means that when sin intrudes and destroys, the result will be very painful. And that's why we need to talk about sins against marriage, not to try to bring up something that is painful, but to try to understand what causes the pain. Fourth, this is difficult because no one seems to know what the word marriage means anymore. And this is increasingly true in a legal sense, I realize, but I mean it in a more practical sense. When the world talks about marriage, they're talking about a self-centered, sexually driven, temporary experiment with romance. And then, when they find that experiment to be disappointing and difficult, they criticize marriage and suggest we'd be better without it. But of course, marriage is going to disappoint you if you craft a version of it based on man's wisdom, not God's. Then fifth, and I think finally, the world expects us to be both snobby and hypocritical as we talk about these things. They expect the preacher to get up here and rant about all those terrible people out there who are living in sin. They expect me to shout and pound my Bible and get red in my face and denounce them and tell them they're all going to hell, unlike the good people who just happen to be those of us in this room. And at the same time, they expect us to be secretly hypocritical, sinning against marriage ourselves in many ways while we pound our Bibles and tell them they're going to hell. So let me say from the outset that I am not preaching this sermon series to our culture. Of course, I'll talk about it as we go along, but I'm preaching it to us, to feed our hearts on God's truth so that he might lead us away from our own tendencies to sin against marriage. We are not the good people, for there are no good people. We are sinners who have been forgiven only because Jesus took the penalty for our sin. We are not better than anyone else. And so while there's a sense in which we call the world to God's way, we are also calling ourselves to God's way. And all of us need the same Savior because we've all taken our own way. So we're not on a pedestal above anybody else. We're sinners together at the foot of the cross, looking to Jesus and learning from him. All right, that's enough introduction. Let's spend the rest of our time this morning with some introduction. Considering God's introduction, how the book of Genesis introduces us to the sins against marriage. This is the earliest record of human history, yet when Genesis speaks about marriage, it sounds like today's news. So that gives you a little clue about how hopeful and encouraging this morning's message will be, about as hopeful and encouraging as today's news. Let's begin with Genesis 3:6. And the reason why we go ahead and listen to that message is because it's God's. This is God's introduction for us. Genesis 3:6, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. Eve sinned by offering the fruit to her husband. Now, she had first sinned by taking it herself, but then she immediately sinned by tempting her husband to sin. The intimacy of a marriage makes it an especially dangerous place for influencing one another to sin. You want to love and support each other. You don't want to upset each other. And so it's very tempting to go along with the sins of your husband or wife. And so that Adam then also sins by not standing up to her. See verse 17? Then to Adam, God said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, here's the curse. Think about that. Because you listen to the voice of your wife? How messed up is this? Don't we spend most of our time saying, men, listen. Listen to your wife. Give her your attention. Ask good clarifying questions. Show her you understand. Care. God says, Adam, you shouldn't have listened to her. That is how sin makes things so complicated. From the first moment, sin complicated marriage. A godly husband is a wonderful, tender, gracious listener, full of respect and honor for what his wife says, and he also knows how to graciously stand up to her. That's hard. That is complicated. Sin complicates it. Verse 16, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children, yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. As we talked about back in the anger series, the word here used for Eve's desire means an urge to control or dominate. Part of the curse is a struggle with conflicting marital desires. Before Adam and Eve sinned, they didn't have a sinful nature that conflicted with the others. But once they sin, now Eve has this new desire, the urge to control or dominate her husband, yet that is not God's plan for marriage. And then you bring in Adam's own sinful temptations to the mix. And so without God's heart-changing grace, marriage is a recipe for disaster. Verse 17, then to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying you shall not eat it, cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it will grow for you. Verse 19, by the sweat of your face you're going to eat bread. All of that hints at a whole other area of common marital frustration, which leads to marital sin, and that is the area of work. Work is hard and it's frustrating. And so maybe a wife feels like her husband is lazy and he isn't providing. Or maybe she feels like her husband has gone to work way too much and he's never home. He may be very frustrated at all the weeds that are growing in his workplace. Or they might be trying to juggle both of them working. Work was not a source of burden and marital conflict before the fall, but sin created all those complications. Now we reach Genesis 4, and we've already noted verse 19, Lamech took 2 wives. And Genesis 4:23 gives us a little glimpse of Lamech's character. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, listen to my voice. You wives of Lamech, give heed to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me and a boy for striking me. Are you surprised that the man who followed his lust for 2 wives also followed his passions to murder? And note that Lamech is saying this to his wives. They are having to live with his character and his influence. The intimate nature of marriage means that husbands and wives have great influence on one another, either negatively or positively, or some mixture of both usually. Now look with me in Genesis 6. And we'll read the first 5 verses of Genesis 6. Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh, and nevertheless his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. All right, that's a controversial passage, I realize, and those controversies are not my point this morning. Just look at verse 2. They saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Was that good? I think the next verses make it clear that it was not. It sounds like, the way somebody buys a new cell phone. They saw that the new phone was beautiful and had a great screen and amazing camera, so they bought phones for themselves, whichever phones they chose. It sounds like commercialism, right? Verse 5 says that every intent of the thoughts of their heart was only evil continually. I wonder how many couples were together on this recent Valentine's Day, and for one or both of them, if God were to speak his analysis of their time together, he would say, the intent of your heart was only evil continually. How many TV shows and movies portray something that they call romance that would actually be described by God as evil intent? So these opening verses of Genesis 6 remind us that men and women often do evil and destructive things against one another to satisfy their sensual desires. And that connects right into 1 Thessalonians 4, which says, if you take advantage of one another like that, God is the avenger of such things. Turn ahead with me to Genesis 16. Genesis 16:1. Now Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarah said to Abram, now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid. Perhaps I will obtain children through her. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah. After Abraham had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarah took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. Yikes. What a terrible violation of God's intended purpose for sexuality. One man, one woman within the covenant bonds of marriage. That's the one appropriate place. The sexual relationship is a symbol of the commitment of loyal love. And when Sarah brought a second woman into her husband, she completely violated the God-given role of sexuality and the intimacy of their relationship. And that was bound to end only in tragedy. Verse 4, he went into Hagar and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. And Sarah said to Abraham, may the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abraham said to Sarah, behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. So Sarah treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. Whoa. Hagar's mad at Sarah. Sarah's mad at Hagar. Sarah's mad at Abraham. Everybody's mad at everybody. It's a little free love will do. And this family conflict is still front page news today. When you violate God's plan for marriage, you can expect jealousy and anger and rejection. Note again that just as with Adam and Eve, Abraham was good at giving into his wife's wishes and not so good at leading her in what was right. At the end of verse 2, he listened to her. We could continue to Genesis 19. You can turn there, though we're not going to read Genesis 19, but that chapter, I'm going to show you one verse in a minute. That's why I say you can turn there. Genesis 19 introduces same-sex relationships and the consequences of those for shalom. And that's just a reminder for us of how many things are described in Genesis that should never even have to be there. You have vocabulary words like concubine and harlot, where you're thinking, those words did not even need to exist at the end of Genesis 2. There was no reason for that kind of vocabulary. We have to create an entire vocabulary to describe the sins against marriage. Let me show you one thing in Genesis 19, verse 14. Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, and said, up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city. But he appeared to his sons-in-law to be jesting. So, again, my point's not really the context, though that's interesting, but the in-laws. In-laws exist because marriage exists, right? While a man and woman leave father and mother to create a new primary loyalty, their families don't disappear, gratefully. Instead, marriage brings an intersection of families, and that can be a great source of blessing. My wife's parents have been second parents to me in the most wonderful kind of way. And if there was no sin, in-laws would always be a great source of blessing. The merging of together, the intersecting of two families would be a source of blessing. Yet instead, sin often intrudes. The whole ideas of in-laws is kind of a joke in our culture in a negative way. And so my point is just that marriage creates an intersection of families, a necessary intersection of families that can be quickly corrupted by sin, rather than the blessing that God intends it to be. Now into chapter 21, and I want to show you just one verse from which I want to springboard to three big ideas. Genesis 21, verse 21. This is talking about Ishmael and his mother Hagar. Ishmael lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. All right, three ideas I'd like to talk about here. And again, this is that son that was born to Abraham through Hagar. First of all, if we just ignore the story for a minute, the words, his mother took a wife for him, probably ought to make your eyebrow go up a little bit, and remind us that Christians face a difficult question regarding the process of finding a spouse. Should your mother take a wife for you? Or should your dad take a wife for you? Or should your family take a wife for you? Or should her dad take you for her? Or your family and her family? Or her family? Or you and her? Or should you use prayer alone and just wait for God to bring you a wife without any involvement by other parties like that? And some Bible teachers have taken some of these Old Testament stories and suggested that there is a Bible way to do it. And that is based on very poor and inconsistent Old Testament interpretation. If you believe that these Old Testament narratives teach a Bible way to pursue marriage, then we got to talk about all the other Bible ways that you can find in the Old Testament narratives that you're ignoring completely. That is a very poor way of interpreting the Old Testament. So no, there is not a Bible way to do this, though there are clear Bible principles. And I would suggest that while the Bible says very little about the process itself, what the Bible puts a dominating emphasis on is the need for you to biblically understand love and marriage so that you're looking for the right thing in the first place. God can use a lot of different processes. And one of the ways, one of the reasons I say that is because, Crystal and I's story is not a story I'd recommend to most anybody. It's weird. We met as high schoolers. We fell in love, whatever that means, immediately. And we dated forever and got married with very little parental involvement by my parents, but quite a bit of parental involvement by hers. Would I say, yeah, that's the formula, follow our formula? No. But what really matters is that at the outset, you're looking for the right thing because you understand marriage and you understand where you find true love and you understand why you would care about marriage in the first place. And if you're not clear on all those things, then marriage will be to you an idol you pursue, and it will be damaging and very hurtful. And so it is not the process that I think should be really the point of our obsession, so much as what are you looking for in the first place? Why do you care about marriage in the first place? And however the process goes, in whatever way it goes, what is the final decision that has to be made? It is the vows, and nobody else can make that decision for that couple. The final decision that must be made is a man and a woman themselves must decide to make covenant vows before God and witnesses. Because marriage is not a cultural tradition to follow, it is not a fun adventure to try, it is a covenant relationship before God. And so that is ultimately the decision that must be made, the choice to enter into a covenant relationship. All right, don't misinterpret anything I just said. I know that I used this line, his mother took a wife for him, as a springboard, but I didn't say that moms shouldn't be involved in this process. It's not what I said. Moms are a very important part of this process, all right? And so are dads and some other people too. All right, now look back at verse 21 again. Let me show you something else. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Oh, now that's another bit of interesting complication. Look ahead at Genesis 24, verse 1. Genesis 24, verse 1. Now Abraham was old, advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in every way. Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he owned, please place your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I live, but you will go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac. You have something similar over in chapter 27, verse 46. Rebekah said to Isaac, I am tired of living because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife from the daughters of Heth like these, from the daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me? So, though it's not at all a direct parallel between Israel, the family of Abraham, and other families, it does just remind us of the possible complication of children from Christian families marrying non-Christians. I still remember pretty vividly the first time one of my Christian acquaintances growing up in Salt Lake City chose to marry a Mormon. And I remember just being staggered, like that was beyond what my mind could even wrap around in my naive little world, how that could be possible. Then one final set of observations from verse 21. Hagar took a wife for Ishmael. Let's back up to the story, okay? Back at Genesis 21, verse 1. Why did we reach a point where we have a line in the Bible like, his mother took a wife for him? How did we reach that point? Genesis 21, verse 1. Then the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Now Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking. Therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her, for I have a plan. Through Isaac your descendant shall be named, and of the son of the maid I will make a nation also because he is your descendant. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, and gave her the boy and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. That is an astonishing moment in verse 14. Off you go into the desert, have a good life. We say that line as a joke today, that have a good life line. That's what just happened. Do you think that that Abraham and Sarah had that moment in mind when they decided to sin against marriage in the first place? A moment years later when Hagar and her son would be sent off into the desert, hope you survive? Verses 20 and 21, God was with the lad, and he grew, and he lived in the wilderness and became an archer. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Now the land of Egypt thing makes a little more sense. Now the mother taking a wife for him thing makes a little more sense. The phrase that's commonly used for this today is a broken family. Sin often creates broken family situations where it seems like a no-win. Do Hagar and Ishmael stay with Abraham so that you have two wives, two conflicting intimate relationships, two sets of children? Or do Hagar and Ishmael leave, which means that Hagar does not have a husband to care for her, and Ishmael does not have an active father in his life? Which of those losing situations would you choose? That's the kind of thing sin does. It creates such complicated messes that there feels like no way out. Now, sometimes humanly, there isn't a circumstantial way out. That doesn't mean there is not great hope through Jesus to rebuild fresh hope and purpose from the rubble of sin, even to be a father to the fatherless and like a husband to those who are alone. But it should sure motivate us to follow God's plan for sexuality and marriage. Sin seldom warns us about the consequences down the road. Yet there will be consequences to the sins against marriage. But let me say it again, here in the rubble, God can rebuild. The church cannot be a place that is only for those with happy, healthy marriages who fit the stereotype of a husband, wife, and a few adorable kids. The church must be a place for the fatherless, the singles, the childless, the widows, the divorced, the single parents, the separated, those struggling with same-sex desire, those who have been broken through immorality. This is part of the reason why we don't have the word family in our church name, and I mean no criticism to those who do. But if we were a Grace Family Bible Church or something like that, whatever we might mean by that, what that would communicate to people is that we're a church for happy, smiling, perfect little families. And we have to say, no, that's not true. Our church is a place for broken people who have a desire for the Bible and for Jesus and for hope. And the happy little families are broken. All those kids are sinners. Cute dresses to the contrary, right? Those moms and dads are sinners. There are problems in those marriages. There are sinful dangers to those marriages. There is no happy little profile of the right kind of people to come to church. Church is a place for human beings who want the Creator to speak truth into their broken lives. And whatever the form of your humanness takes, whether it's husband and wife and little row of happy children or something very different from that, welcome to the family of Christ. Welcome to the group of people who say, we need hope, we need help, we need truth. So let's be a place where people can find hope no matter what their story is, rather than feeling unwanted or unworthy or out of place. We left our home this morning with my wife in tears, one of my children very upset, and our family going, pew! So what do? Do I take the day off as pastor? Let me ask you a harder question. Does it make me a hypocrite for standing up here and preaching to you? Are you a hypocrite for coming to church when your family's struggling? Well, we can never be a church just for families. We can be a church family that is united in support of these marriages here in our church. Whether you are married or single or divorced or widowed, as a follower of Jesus, you say, marriage is very strategic as an illustration of the gospel, and I'm going to support the marriages around me in every way I can. Genesis 25, verse 1 now. Genesis 25:1. Now Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. Well, what happened before that? Sarah died. So here you have a widower remarrying. And in the original creation, there was no death to interrupt marriage. But now there is. And so that introduces the blessings and the challenges of remarriage, which integrates two families together in another way than what we've talked about so far. So blended families have existed since the fall. The whole Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, Isaac story is a blended family story. And then over to Genesis 28. Genesis 28:8. So Esau saw that the daughters of Canaan displeased his father Isaac, and so Esau went to Ishmael and married, besides the wives that he had, Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth. What a terrible reason for a marriage. What a terrible reason. Yet, how many marriages are for terrible reasons? And then to Genesis 29, and we're going to look at two final chapters here, and we're not going to try to follow all the stories. We don't have time. I'm just going to pull out some key phrases. Genesis 29, this is Jacob and Laban and Rachel and Leah. And Genesis 29, verse 21, then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my time is completed, that I may go into her. And then you know what happens there probably. Verse 26, Laban said, it's not the practice in our place to marry off the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we'll give you the other also. And so verse 28, Jacob did so and completed her week, and he gave him his daughter Rachel as his wife. Can you imagine a dad setting up a polygamous relationship for his daughters? How broken is that? He had no clue about God's plan for marriage, no idea about why marriage existed, no sense of how marriage should flourish. Otherwise, he would never have used deception to put his daughters in that position. And so then you get heartbreak. What do you expect you're going to get? Verse 32, Leah conceived and bore a son and named him Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has seen my affliction, surely now my husband will love me. Oh, how messed up is that? Look at verse 34. She conceived again and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will become attached to me because I've borne him 3 sons. Oh, is that the way things are supposed to be? I had a son for my husband. Now maybe he'll care about me. Now maybe he'll pay attention to me. Now maybe he'll love me. How broken is that? Chapter 30, verse 4. So here's Jacob and Rachel. So Rachel gave Jacob her maid Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. No, don't do that again. We heard about this before. Verse 9, when Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. No, don't do that again. We've heard about that before. Look at verse 15. But she said to her, is it a small matter for you to take my husband? And would you take my son's mandrakes also? So Rachel said, therefore, he may lie with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes. Great, great. Now we're trading it. Trading intimacy doesn't it make you want to cry? Or doesn't it make you want to rush in and say, stop, no, don't do this. Don't do this to your lives. Don't do this to your futures. Don't do this to yourselves. God has something better. And when you see that kind of moment here in Genesis 30, then just look around at the world we live in. You know, mandrakes aren't a hot topic, but other things are. And the means of violating God's plan for marriage have slightly different forms, but the choices themselves are hardly different. How many heartbreaking, life-altering choices were made on Valentine's Day? How many places around the world could you have been on Valentine's Day, and if you could have watched and listened to a scenario unfolding between a man and a woman, you would have wanted to rush in and say, no, what are you doing? Don't do this to yourselves. Don't do this to your lives. Don't do this to your futures. Genesis 34. Genesis 34, this is the last thing we'll look at. Again, we're not trying to follow the story here, just looking at the brokenness. Genesis 34, verse 4. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, get me this young girl for a wife. Look at verse 8. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Verse 12. Ask me ever so much bridal payment and gift, and I'll give it according as you say to me. But just give me the girl in marriage. Verse 21. These men are friendly with us. Therefore, let them live in the land and trade in it. For behold, the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters in marriage and give our daughters to them. How's all that sound? Does that sound like the way things ought to be? Does it sound familiar, though? I just want to be married. I don't care what it costs me. I don't care what I have to do. I don't care what anybody else says. All I want to do is be married. That sound familiar today? Do whatever feels good. Marriage is kind of a game. Free love was not invented in the 1960s. And from these little glimpses, you can see, you can know that the rest of this story is going to be brutal. And boy, is it brutal if you keep reading. And I don't think brutal is too misguided a word to describe what marriage has become today. Why has marriage become brutal? Why are so many people ready to be done with it altogether? It's because of the sins against marriage. The problem is not with marriage. Marriage is a perfect creation of God. The problem is what sin does to marriage. Can you believe how many examples of this we've seen in the book of Genesis? I mean, I know it wasn't fun to work through this, but the breadth of what we've seen this morning is astonishing. The Bible's relevance is astonishing. Modern people think they're so progressive, so far ahead of the times, so advanced beyond ancient primitive religious superstition. Yet the problems and challenges of marriage and morality described in the early chapters of the first book in the Bible are precisely the problems and challenges faced by 21st century Western men and women. Maybe moderns aren't nearly as advanced as they think they are. Maybe they're actually enslaved and unable to free themselves from the same problems that began in the Garden of Eden. Maybe there's a slavery that began now and is still here. That began then and is still here today. Maybe they're sinners just like Adam and Eve. And maybe the true advancement is not what they perceive as cultural progression, but maybe it happens through Christ-like transformation. And could I suggest that those who are truly culturally advanced are those who are being changed by the power of Jesus to live out human relationships, including marriage, in a way that is a reflection of what it's supposed to be, the way God originally created it. Isn't that actually advancement? Going back to the Garden of Eden, back to shalom, back to the way things ought to be? Is it possible that a Christ-centered, loyal, joyful marriage is the greatest display of moral advancement you'll find today? That's not going to come from your own heart. Your own heart will only tend to sin against marriage. It's not going to come from the world, for if we absorb the world's ideas, we are destined to the same heartache and pain that has characterized these thousands of years. But we are definitely not without hope, for the Creator of marriage has made us his people by his mercy, as we sang about repeatedly this morning. He has made a covenant vow of loyal love to us, the Creator of marriage. He has sent his Son as the greatest demonstration of servant love, and he is changing us from the inside out, empowering us to love like him. Wouldn't that be a better place to go for hope and for help? And so what we want to do in the weeks ahead is we want to listen to what God says. Not just the God who created marriage, though that's reason enough, but the God who gives to us the only love that will really, truly satisfy your heart. The love that sets you free to go love another sinner in marriage in a God-glorifying celebration of the gospel. So my prayer is that in these weeks ahead, the sins against marriage, which tempt all of our hearts, would flee away in the light of the gospel, the cross, the beauty of God's way and God's plans, and the depth and solidity of God's love for us.